Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Lucy Tassell.
Late yesterday afternoon, a long-awaited verdict was handed down in the mushroom murder trial of Erin Patterson. A jury found Patterson guilty on all 3 charges of murder, which carries a maximum penalty of life imprisonment in Victoria, and she was also found guilty of attempted murder.
Patterson was charged after she served her estranged husband's relatives a beef Wellington lunch that included death cap mushrooms. Prosecutors alleged she put them in the meal intentionally, while the defence argued it was a mistake. Today, we'll update you on the latest in the trial, from verdict to sentencing, what led to this moment, and what comes next.
Lucy, you, like many of us, have been following this case very closely over the last few months, even the last couple of years.
Yeah.
It's been a prominent story in the Australian media landscape for some time now. We finally have a verdict.
Yes.
Can you walk us through what happened in the case yesterday?
Yeah, so yesterday afternoon, we all got the news alert that the jury was finished their deliberations, which had taken about a week. They went into being sequestered. We'll explain that more later, but they went in to deliberate last Monday, and so they had come to a verdict. Justice Christopher Beale presided over the reading of the verdict, which was delivered to a packed courtroom in the Latrobe Valley Magistrates Court, which is where all of this has taken place. In court, there's differing accounts of Patterson's reaction. From the ABC, we heard that she showed little emotion. From Nine, we heard that she blinked a lot. That was kind of the main reaction that she showed, but certainly there wasn't a large emotional reaction.
When she heard those verdicts
Yes.
on those 4 charges.
Yes, when she was read the verdict. And she was found guilty of 3 counts of murder. Those relate to the deaths of Don Patterson and Gail Patterson, that's her estranged husband Simon's parents, and Heather Wilkinson, who is her estranged husband Simon's aunt. And then, of course, there's the account of attempted murder that relates to Ian Wilkinson. That's Heather's husband, so Simon's uncle, and he survived the lunch.
Okay. So as we've kind of touched on, this is a case that has captivated not just Australians, but the world for quite some time now. We've discussed the details of it on the podcast. We've discussed the big updates from what ended up being a 10-week hearing. But can you just give us a quick reminder of how we got here? Tell us about that fateful lunch.
Yeah, so for those who are unfamiliar or who might have forgotten the details in all of the information that's been presented during the trial, so Erin Patterson invited 5 people over to lunch at her home in eastern Victoria in the town of Leongatha in July 2023. So the people that she invited were her husband Simon. So they were estranged but still very much legally married. His parents, Don and Gail, and his aunt and uncle, Heather and Ian Wilkinson. The night before, Simon told Erin via text that he wouldn't be attending. We saw those texts tendered in court as evidence. Then the lunch went ahead anyway. So Don, Gail, Heather, Ian, and Erin, they all sit down for a meal of beef Wellington. So for those who don't know, a beef Wellington is a log of beef. It's coated in a mushroom paste called duxelle, and then it's wrapped in pastry. Erin made individual beef Wellingtons that differed from the recipe that she was using, which came from the Recipe Tin Eats cookbook dinner, which is on the shelf probably in your home right now.
Pretty iconic.
Yeah, best-selling cookbook. Now that recipe calls for a single log. She chose to make individual slices.
Which we heard in court was because she couldn't find a piece of steak or beef that was big enough to make the log, so she made individual portions. That, of course, then was contested over the weeks of this hearing.
Yes, about whether or not she could have found. Her evidence was that she couldn't find it. She bought individual steaks. So following the lunch, Don, Gail, Heather and Ian all become extremely unwell. Erin gave evidence that she also became unwell. Her 4 guests all went to hospital. Erin then later went to hospital. Don and Gail and Heather died in hospital in the following days. Ian Wilkinson survived. He required a liver transplant, but he did live, and he attended court.
And he was in hospital for a lengthy period.
Yes, you might have remembered the headlines around when he came out of hospital, that was kind of the biggest development in that case in those later months of 2023 until Erin herself was charged in November 2023.
So you mentioned, Lucy, Erin did go to hospital.
Yeah.
What do we know about her condition? How was she physically after the lunch?
Yeah, she was not as sick as her guests. That is certainly not contested. She has given evidence that she was sick. So she said that she had been having diarrhea for days, took herself into the hospital to get some fluids, and that's when doctors told her, oh, you are the person from this lunch that we've heard about. Everyone else who was there is really, really critically ill and we're very worried about you. Did anyone else eat this? She at that point said that her children had been given some of the meal, but that she'd scraped the mushrooms off because they don't like them. And they told her her kids needed to come into hospital. She pretty soon after checked herself out of hospital. She said that was to deal with some things at home, like letting out the dog, feeding the sheep that were in her paddock. And then she later returned to hospital and she gave evidence that she had had diarrhea. But yeah, there's contested evidence about how sick she actually was. It's certainly clear that she didn't need a liver transplant. She didn't need as much care as the others. One of the reasons she gave for why that might be the case is that she had a history of disordered eating, and she said that she had binged and then thrown up some of the food from the lunch. She suggested that might be, or rather the defense suggested that might be why she wasn't as sick, because it wasn't in her system for as long.
Okay. So that paints a little bit of a picture of the defense, which we'll go into more shortly. But what was the prosecution's case against Patterson? Because obviously this is ultimately the successful argument.
Yeah. It's kind of strange to be thinking about that now. I feel like for the entire length of the trial, it's obviously, as responsible journalists, you have to be incredibly careful about what you say about a case while it's still in the court, at risk of prejudicing the jury. But yeah, it feels strange now to be able to say one side has definitively...
Exactly.
I mean, there could still be an appeal, but that's...
We will get to that.
We'll get to that. Sorry, jumping ahead of myself. The prosecution argument, which, as you said, has now been found by the jury to be the more convincing one. Prosecutors argued Patterson deliberately put death cap mushrooms in the beef Wellington to kill her guests. They painted a picture of a woman who had two faces, a polite face to her in-laws in person and her real face speaking to her Facebook friends online, expressing frustration about her in-laws' role in her relationship with her estranged husband, which had been cooling in recent years, despite many years of amicable separation.
Okay.
Dr. Nanette Rogers, she's the prosecutor, she told the jury Patterson had researched death cap mushrooms online and purchased a dehydrator, a food dehydrator, to prepare them. The prosecution presented evidence that Patterson lied repeatedly to police about whether or not she foraged and whether or not she had a dehydrator. And they also highlighted that Patterson had thrown away the dehydrator at the tip just 2 days before her police interview, which you probably have seen the CCTV footage of her throwing away the dehydrator. Yeah.
A lot was said about where the mushrooms came from, whether or not she'd foraged them herself, whether or not she'd purchased them from an Asian grocer, whether they were in her pantry for a long period of time and she accidentally had death caps.
Which was the defense argument,
Exactly. So tell me a little bit more about the defense argument.
Hello, Billy here from TDA. We have just looked at our YouTube analytics and 95% of you who are watching our videos aren't subscribing. If you want to help independent media like us grow, the best way you can do that is by pressing subscribe. Thank you so much, and back to the video.
Yeah, so Patterson admitted on the stand that she had foraged for mushrooms and then stored them in a Tupperware container. The defense's argument and her argument was that if death caps were mixed in, which she admitted was possible, it was just a tragic accident, that she had never intentionally foraged for poisonous mushrooms, and that they're ending up in the meal, which she said was to add flavour to the mushroom paste, the foraged mushrooms, was just a mistake. Okay. And I mentioned there that she took the stand. As we would know, that's a very rare thing in court cases.
Yeah, I remember this case really taking a sharp turn when we learned that Erin Patterson would be taking the stand as witness to give testimony in her own trial. She provided evidence over a period of several days.
Yeah.
What were the key learnings and revelations from that time?
The biggest one for me that I think safe to say the most surprised to see someone admit on the stand was Erin admitted to telling several lies during her original police interview. So we've touched on the foraging and the dehydrator. So she lied. She told them she had never foraged for mushrooms and that she didn't own a dehydrator. I suppose that one's sort of a half-truth because she at that moment did not own a dehydrator because it was in the local tip, but she had owned one until days earlier. On the stand, she also admitted to misleading her guests about having cancer. She told the court she wanted their support but had never actually been diagnosed with cancer, but she said that she kind of led them to believe that that was the case because she was seeking their support in coming weeks because she said she was thinking about getting gastric banding surgery to assist with weight loss.
And that during the recovery period, she would need additional family support with the kids, etc.
So she said she was just eliding the actual requirement for that support.
Okay. There was, of course, an extensive list of lies that were dissected, explained, re-prosecuted during that testimony.
Yeah.
We did a whole podcast episode on that, which actually you led, Lucy, expertly.
Thank you.
Super, super interesting. We will pop a link to that in the show notes if you want to hear more. But we must move on or we'll spend all day talking about the fascinating developments from that trial.
Yeah.
But after what ended up being 10 weeks of hearings, the judge finally gave quite extensive instructions to the jury over several days before they began deliberations last week.
Yeah.
What are the key updates from that time? What do we need to know?
I think the biggest one to know is that Justice Beale said Patterson needs to be presumed innocent until she's proven guilty, and that the jury are the only ones who can decide whether the prosecution has, quote, proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, that's the threshold in criminal cases. You've probably heard us on this podcast before talk about how in civil cases, it's a lower standard of proof, which is on the balance of probabilities. But in a criminal case, it's you have to not have any reasonable doubt in your mind that something occurred the way that the prosecution presented it as happening.
Yeah.
If you have a reasonable doubt, you can't find a person guilty of a crime.
So it's like being 90 to 100% sure of something versus being 51% sure of something.
It's not even 90, it has to be 100.
There you go.
You have to be, well, certainly, I mean, that's what the defense said, right? But I think that is also a legal principle that you can't have a doubt.
Yeah. So the jury had 15 members throughout the trial. We know that there were not 15 jurors on the stand yesterday when they came back into the court to hand down their verdict.
Yeah.
What was that process?
So one juror was dismissed during the trial. It was reported they had been discussing the trial with their family members, which is not allowed.
Yep.
Jurors weren't sequestered. They weren't kept separate from the rest of the world during the trial, which is also partly why we have to be careful in the media in terms of accidentally saying something that could come across a juror's path that could influence their decision making. So we were down to 14, and then last week, before the jury began deliberating, 2 more were dismissed. So the court system takes in more jurors than will actually make the decision.
Particularly in a high-profile case like this.
Yeah, in case of illness or family emergency, any of the reasons why people might not be able to complete the full trial. So 2 were dismissed, and then the final 12, they were then sequestered, which means that they were kept separate from the rest of the world, didn't go home for the days that they were deliberating, were taken probably to a hotel, no media, no phone, only the case and the deliberations every day.
So they were essentially put into a lockdown bubble of this jury where they had no communication with the outside world, no access to any communication devices. It was, you will stay together until you can reach a decision.
Yes, and that had to be a unanimous decision, and we now know a unanimous verdict of guilty on all 4 charges.
So tell me how it all unfolded on Monday. On Monday afternoon, we got the news. The newsroom here at TDA was ready to go. We've been waiting for a while for this one. What charges specifically has Erin Patterson been found guilty of?
Yeah, so there's 3. So there's a count of murder of Don Patterson, a count of murder of Gail Patterson, a count of murder of Heather Wilkinson, and a count of attempted murder for Ian Wilkinson, who survived. That's about all we know in terms of the jury's thinking, that they collectively found Erin Patterson responsible beyond a reasonable doubt. Australian jurors are not allowed to speak in the media about their decision making, and we will never know what was discussed in the jury room. Yeah.
Is it never, or is it like 5 years?
No, never.
Wow.
We'll never know. Yeah. It's not like the US. That's it forever. We won't know why it took that amount of time, what their decisions were, if there was a split. I suppose someone could leak it, but I mean, there would be 12 suspects. So
yeah,
it's kind of an easy deterrent there.
Got it. Okay, so just to recap, Lucy, we've got 3 charges of murder Erin Patterson has been found guilty of.
Yeah.
1 count of attempted murder, guilty. Also, that's the decision there. What happens now?
So Erin is remanded in custody. She's awaiting being sentenced. We don't yet know when she will be sentenced.
Okay. And that decision will be up to the judge. The jury are dismissed.
Yep, that's it. The jury's jobs are done. They go back to their lives. I mean, imagine just going back to work tomorrow knowing that you couldn't talk about it.
Yeah.
It would be strange. But yes, so basically at this point, it's the legal system takes over. The prosecution, the defense makes submissions about what they think the sentence should be.
Okay.
The maximum sentence for murder is life. We just don't know what is going to pan out there, but we know that Erin is in custody. We also know that the next time she appears in court will be for victim impact statements.
What does that mean?
So that means that the people who have been affected by what a jury has now found were Erin's actions will be able to speak to the court, to the judge, and to Erin herself about the impact that this has had on them. So I imagine we'll be hearing from the families of, well, yeah, I guess once upon a time, Erin's family, right? Erin's extended family. Probably from Ian Wilkinson. I'm just speculating, but I imagine when you think of the people who've been affected, Don and Gail's other grandchildren, Heather and Ian's grandchildren and children.
Yep.
Yeah, we will be hearing from them before sentencing is decided.
That will be fascinating, and we will keep an eye on that. As Lucy said, the sentencing date is yet to be set, but the murder charge in Victoria carries life imprisonment, which is typically 25 years. Attempted murder also carries a maximum sentence of 25 years.
Yeah.
So on maths alone, we're looking at a very, very lengthy prison sentence for Erin Patterson.
Yeah.
Lucy, thank you so much for taking us through that. And thank you over the course of these hearings for breaking it all down for us and helping us get our heads around such a complicated case.
It's a fascinating case, yeah.
That's all we've got time for on today's episode. We will be back later this afternoon with your latest evening news headlines. But until then, have a great day.